Thanks so much, everybody, for being here this afternoon and letting me speak to you a little bit more about balancing busy work with getting real work done. My name is Vinny. I'm a product design manager at Zendesk. I've been working at Zendesk for about 18 months now, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the prior experience I have and why it's kind of led me to giving this talk today. Before we get into it, though, I think there's a couple of things I wanted to say right up front, which is this is not going to be a productivity talk. It's not just about managing your calendar or your workload. Really, the focus of today is thinking about how to get your focus off a lot of the internal kind of admin tasks that can take up a lot of our time and our days, and making sure that we're spending enough focus on our customers and the outside world and the context in which our business operates. So hopefully I'll give you a few tools to kind of help you do that in your work. For me, so I've worked at companies of lots of different scales. When I started as a UX designer, very much on the tools, I worked in some smaller agencies. We're talking 3 full-time staff. Worked in another agency with about 10 staff full-time. I've spent some time working at startups. So one startup in particular, a fintech I worked at, really early stage startup, but we did have about 30 employees at the time. That was a really different experience. Obviously working in an agency with 3 different people in it. And then really the last 5 years of my career have been spent working in much larger enterprise companies. So I worked at MYOB, who make accounting software here in Australia and New Zealand, about 3,000 employees, about 1 million customers. And then more recently, I've been working at Zendesk. So even bigger in terms of employee scale, we've got about 5,000 employees. And we're actually operating much more globally. So not just building software for one particular region. What I've found is as the business grows, so whether the business itself grows or whether you just move to a different business, which is bigger, it can get really hard to do things. When you've got 3 people, so again, let's look at that agency. There's 3 people, there's 3 relationships that we really have to be worried about inside that business. If you add 2 new people, you're actually adding 7 relationships. So the complexity is getting bigger very, very quickly. If you scale this up to 3,000 people, I'm not going to try to draw all the lines in there. I will tell you there's about 5 million relationships that we then have to deal with. Of course, if you're in an organization of 3,000 people, you don't need to maintain 5 million relationships to get work done, thankfully. But as you start to work on projects that involve more people and more teams, hopefully you can see that it just naturally starts to get much more complex to do things. And the amount of collaboration that we have to do really, really rapidly increases, which can really slow things down. It's not just about pure numbers either. I took this GIF from the Zendesk website, and this is showing some of our offices across the globe. So if I go into Slack at any time of day, there's going to be people online doing work. If I'm trying to collaborate with people on the East Coast of US or Europe, the time zones make this a really big challenge for us. This is also a little bit outdated in that it kind of assumes that people are in offices. If we think about, so today's Zendesk is a digital first company. Within the countries that we operate, people could be all over the place. So even if I say flew to San Francisco, it's not like I'm going to get to sit down with the whole West Coast team in one room, because now we're much more broadly distributed across the country. So things have, it's great with remote working that we can get talent from all over the globe and be operating 24/7, but that can make it really challenging to collaborate. And all of a sudden, your activities start to focus around the business in which you're in. So I don't know if this day looks familiar to anyone on the call, but certainly could be an example of a day that I'd experienced. So you got some kind of training you have to do in the morning. Maybe you got to sync with some VPs. Might have a team all hands. I'm going to be generous, and you're going to have time for lunch, which isn't necessarily always the case. Might have a design critique session if you're in the design team, sync with a product design team, skip level one-on-one, manager one-on-one. These are all very real meetings and rituals that we have, certainly in teams that I've worked in different companies. The one thing that all these have in common is that they're very much internally focused around your business and your rituals, and they're actually not all that focused on the customers. Like where, for example, is the customer interviews in here? Where are we actually going out and talking to customers? It's really easy when you're working inside a business to start to distort where the center of the world is. I spend all my time working for Zendesk, wearing my Zendesk hoodie, logging into Zendesk software, having the tabs open on my screen all day, talking to people about Zendesk. it's really easy for that to become the center of my world. And, we talk about third parties that work with Zendesk, and we look at products like Stripe or Salesforce or Shopify. And it's really easy to see ourselves as the center of the world and these other products all just kind of hanging off our product. When we actually go and speak to customers, though, that's not always the case. So for our customers, like what we often find is they have some other tool that they use. Often it's a purpose-built thing. And then they're plugging in all these different SaaS products to work in it. And yeah, Zendesk is part of that, but actually we're just one of the cogs in the wheel. And yes, sometimes for some customers, maybe we are the center of the world, but there's a lot of instances where we're not actually the center of the world. And it gets really hard whenever we're so focused and wrapped up in our internal thinking to actually remember where our place is. The world outside your business is actually where everyone that matters is. That's why you've got a job and a business in the first place. So if you spend all your time thinking inside your business and about all the rituals and things that you're doing internally, you really miss this opportunity to see what's happening in the outside world. And the outside world, like that's the market, right? That's where you're operating. That's where all of your customers are living. And more importantly, that's also where your competitors are and other people are lurking. If the world outside your company is changing faster than the world inside your company, the end is near. So it's really important that we have some kind of external focus and that we're not just so wrapped up in the internal workings of our company. So I said I worked at a fintech startup for a while. We designed software for mortgage brokers, and naturally there was a much more external focus. So I had mortgage brokers at my desk. I had really easy access to customers. I was able to sense and respond quickly. So could prototype something, show it to the mortgage broker, get feedback, implement it right away. There was no kind of red tape that I had to go through. And it was this real sense of everyone was just really hands-on, focused on our customers, and everything was focused externally. It was all very customer-centric. We weren't having lots of these internal sync meetings, which was definitely much easier as a result of our smaller size. But that makes sense because when you're a startup, the focus really has to be external to survive. If we think about these scales between your external and internal focus, as a startup, you're seeking that product market fit, right? You're looking for your place in the world and you need to be quick to adapt. And therefore, you're naturally biased to have this external focus. So some of these things I'm talking about around internal focus aren't necessarily as big a problem in that startup world. However, it's not amazing. There was lots of great things that I loved about the experience I had working in startups. But we only had 20 customers at the time. It was actually probably less. I think I'm being a little bit generous with saying we had 20 customers. And what that meant is we had to do a lot of guessing that the stuff that was working for our 20 customers was actually going to scale to a much broader audience. And this was really high stakes stuff. It was high stakes for us because we had a certain amount of cash that was going to run out unless we had success. But then also the people that became early adopters and started to use our product, they were mortgage brokers who were running businesses, and their businesses relied on having software that worked. So it was high stakes for them, but also, the reason that they were early adopters is because they saw some benefits to their business and they wanted things from us. And that became really tricky to navigate whenever you had these people really demanding of particular things from the business. And, while I loved not having any red tape, one of the things I love about my job at the minute is we've got product ops teams and design ops teams that really take away a lot of the admin work that you have to do. So while, yes, there's probably some internal meetings that we didn't have to have in the startup, you do find yourself wrapped up in a lot of these admin tasks just because there's no help with operations. So it's not all amazing. For me, and I've had great experiences everywhere that I've worked, but I found more recently that for my career right now, bigger business just brings that bigger opportunity. And that's something that I really relish, the opportunity to make products that impact millions of customers and not just hundreds of customers. So I think while there's some challenges in bigger businesses, there's also a lot of reward on the other side of it. And really, it's all about finding that balance and how do we shift from, if we are having all these meetings internally and thinking a lot about ourselves and our business, how do we shift the balance? So there's things we're going to have to do internally, but how can we shift that balance so we still have that external focus on our customers? So for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to talk about 5 different ways which will hopefully help you tip those scales. And if you're suffering from some of these problems and you're spending a lot of time thinking about internally how the business runs, hopefully you can find some of these ideas might help you out. First thing is first, so I promised it wasn't a productivity talk, and it still definitely isn't. But you can't do any of this stuff unless you have the right time for it. So you need to clear the decks and make sure you've got some time allocated to focus externally. Put a time limit on rituals. Whenever you go and set a recurring meeting in your calendar tool of choice, so we use Google Calendar, there's a little option in there which says repeat forever, and you should never have that box ticked. Even if it's a meeting that you think is always going to be valuable, limit it to 2 or 3 months, see if it's still valuable. If it's still valuable, you can just click a button and get it going again. So try to avoid these rituals which just run on forever. If you want to go extreme, you could do what Toby, the CEO of Shopify, has done a few times, which is just cancel every single recurring meeting in the calendar every now and then. Yeah, it gets people a little bit upset for a day or two, but it just makes them question all of their meetings and if they're valuable. So a bit extreme, but a really something that I certainly appreciate. I think like the bottom line here is you got to own your time. So you got to be really cautious about the things that you're going to, and not just automatically say yes to every single meeting that comes your way, and really put some effort into how you're designing your calendar and giving yourself some focused time to do really good work. I love this quote from Peter Drucker on this. So without an action plan, the executive in this case just being a knowledge worker, the executive becomes a prisoner of events, and without check-ins to re-examine the plans as events unfold, the executive has no way of knowing which events really matter and which are only noise. I love this idea of the prisoner of events, and it's a concept I think about a lot when there's a lot of meetings in my calendar. Am I a prisoner of events, or do I have some control over what's happening? I think that's a really useful thing to think about. Okay, so we've got some time in our calendars. What are we going to do? And this one is very obvious, but I will still say it because it's also the most important thing you can do as a product person, whether you're a designer or a product manager or even an engineer. And that is talk directly to customers often. Sho is a product director at Figma. He's got a few really good threads that I've followed on Twitter, and this is one that really stood out to me. So there's a difference between a politician who gets their information through polling and focus groups versus one who's really out there pounding the pavement and shaking hands. Voters can tell the difference, users can too. It's great to go and watch people who have done user interviews and watch back those recordings. It's great to view decks with lots of synthesized research that other people have done. It's really different to actually be there one-on-one, and it can be in a Zoom call. Ideally it's in person, but it can be on a Zoom call too. But actually being there live with the customer is a really different feeling and something which I think there's just no substitute for. So spending the time and the effort to actually talk to customers one-on-one and understanding their problems and going there without necessarily a set agenda, I think is something that's really critical. And of all the ways that we could be spending our time, probably the one most valuable thing that we could do. Teresa Torres talks about evolving from a project mindset to a continuous mindset. So it's not enough to just listen to this talk, go and schedule some user interviews next week and then tick the box and move on. This should be something that's actually baked into your process. So rather than just going from project to project and kind of talking to customers on a project basis, how do you ensure that you've got a constant stream of customers coming in and you're constantly taking in their feedback? Teresa's written a great book about continuous discovery, and it's certainly a methodology that I think is really interesting, and we've been trying really hard to implement as well. To give you kind of a really brief real world example of this, we had a feature at Zendesk called Organizations. This has been around in Zendesk for a long time. We spun up a team who was going to do some work on this feature and wanted to make some improvements here. So the first thing that we did was go out and talk to some customers who are using this feature to just try to understand, how is this feature working for you today? What might be some improvements that we could make, and just generally better understand it. How organizations work within our software, UXDX might be an organization within the Zendesk software. And really, it's just a way to bucket together users that belong to an organization. So I'm at Vinny, Elena, and Jess. They're all kind of customers that belong to UXDX. They've got the same domain in this instance. It just makes sense that they're all together, and I can then manage UXDX as an organization and send messages to all these 3 people together, or whatever it is that I need to do. So very much it's just modeling how organizations work in real life. The organization in Zendesk is just like an organization in real life. However, when we went out and started talking to customers about this feature, certainly some customers used it that way. But interestingly, what we started to see was customers would have organizations with names like APAC region and VIP customers and trialists. These are not organizations, certainly in the way that we had imagined organizations to be. But essentially what customers were doing was they were finding like an organization is just a way to group together a bunch of the end users. And there was no other way in the software for them to group together end users. So this was basically a workaround that they were using, and they were lumping their VIP customers into an organization and calling it VIP customers because that's the only way they were able to do it within the software. So as a result of this, we actually found that, okay, like, yeah, there's work that we can do to improve organizations, but this is a whole different problem space that we need to unpack. And this was something that we're actually able to then push up to leadership and actually kick off a whole different stream of work, which was helping people manage end users within Zendesk, which wasn't actually what we'd set out to do initially. So just an example of something that came up because we just went out to speak to the customer with, we weren't going there with a particular agenda, just looking to learn more. And then we learned a lot about what we needed to improve just from seeing the customer workarounds. So there's really no substitute from going out and talking directly to users. Beyond that, it's important to find out where your customers are. Go and meet your customers where they are. So I previously worked at a large accounting software company here in Australia, MYOB. At MYOB, we had this MYOB Partner HQ, which is a Facebook group. You can see in there, it's got 2,500 members roughly, and they're all accountants and bookkeepers who are partners of MYOB.
Thanks, Vinny. That was really great talk. Really, really like that. So I have a question because it's one of the challenges I always face is that calendar looks very familiar with all of those sync meetings and all of those kind of things. And I remember getting that feedback before. You need to control your time. You need to kind of say what you're attending, but everything looks important and everything does seem like, oh, well, if I miss out on that, then something's going to happen and I'm going to find out about it 3 months too late or that kind of thing. So do you have any tips for how you can actually free up time to make sure that it's not a case of dropping the ball in certain areas, but actually being able to free up the time and still doing your job effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really tricky one. I recall this this particular tweet that I saw where someone kind of talks about this endless cycle of like, you have a meeting for a while and then you say, actually, this meeting is useless. Let's move it async. And then you start doing updates async. And then after a few months, it's like, actually, we really need to kick off a meeting for this. Like async isn't working. So we're gonna kick off a meeting again. And I think it's a little bit like that. For me, something that, we really struggle with time zones because we've got people like working all across the world. And we do some, like, one of the defaults I've noticed, and it's certainly different going to Zendesk from my previous company where we're all kind of based in the same location. Everything is recorded. So when we've got kind of larger meetings of groups of people, we tend to record everything. And that means that if for whatever reason you can't make that meeting, if there's something really important that comes up, you've generally got a recording to go back to from the meeting. So certainly whenever we're using these digital tools like Zoom all the time, I think that things like just simply recording meetings makes it really easy to go back to if you need to. Honestly, I think a lot of the time, I don't know how many of those recorded meetings actually get watched all the time, but it certainly means that if something really important comes up, that it is there and you can go back to it and you don't kind of have that feeling that you've missed out. So I think that's one really practical way of doing it. I think even just as simple as it is, like recently one of my teams, we had some new leadership come into the group and we just did a meeting audit. So we just went, okay, what are all the times that different people in our group are actually meeting with each other? And, we found that, there's, this meeting has got like a design and product, but then this one's got engineering and product, but then this one is, so there's all these kind of different subsets of meetings. And when you had it literally in like a Google sheet, like just one big list, it was quite easy to say, hey, like we can combine these two meetings and like remove this meeting and try and clear it. So something as simple as a meeting audit, and whether it's like once every 6 months or something like that, I think is a really practical thing to do.
Yeah, that's great. I haven't heard of that one before, but it makes a lot of sense. The other thing with the recording meetings, I've seen a lot of companies, they have kind of, there's quite good AIs for doing transcripts. So like I've seen places where that gets dumped into a Notion or a Confluence or something like that, that people can search. So yeah, that's great. The other question that I had was around that shift from that kind of, as you were saying, the project to more continuous nature and going to where your customers are. A lot of people kind of struggle with that as a first step, because there's the question of, well, how do I find these people? How do I, like, they don't even know where to start. So what would be your tip to somebody who's kind of not used to that kind of more continuous reaching out and finding them? So I know you said that you've got your Zendesk community and your Facebook, but what if you don't have those?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think it was certainly harder, like I talked about, even in this startup where we just didn't have very many customers. Like I remember one of the tools that we were working on in that particular instance. So it was software for mortgage brokers, but we kind of had a consumer facing side where we were looking at home loans. And I remember like quite literally going to a bakery around the corner and offering to buy people their morning coffee to check out our like home loans website and just give us some really quick feedback, and kind of experimenting with like guerrilla usability testing. So I think depending, that's not necessarily possible with B2B, but certainly when you're looking at consumers, like actually doing some of that guerrilla usability testing. There's also tools out there which can be used, like, for example, I remember in the past using a tool like Airtasker, where, Airtasker is usually where you go somewhere and kind of ask somebody to come and, wash your windows or something like that. But we actually have like constructed it so that it's getting feedback on a particular bit of software, and you can kind of be a little bit creative with how you word the ad and get people with the right experience applying. So I think getting really creative about, those channels in for people, whenever you don't have that scale. I think it's definitely a challenge. I'm not going to say there's any like one really easy way, but I think you just need to try a bunch of different things to get some success. And usually you'll find that one is going to work better than others.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing all of your insights and your kind of answers to the questions there. Hopefully that was useful for people who, like me, have been struggling with that calendar full of meetings and no time to get the real work done.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Cheers.